At 75, you stop expecting big gestures from people, especially from your own children. You learn to appreciate the small things instead. A phone call on a lonely Tuesday, a Christmas card with nothing but a signature, or a text message written too quickly to include a greeting. So when an actual envelope arrived in my mailbox, addressed in my son's familiar handwriting, I stood there on my porch for a long moment, staring at it as though it might bite. Inside, an invitation. Thanksgiving dinner, at his home. After 6 long years, I pressed the card to my chest. I didn't cry. My tears dried up years ago, when the silence between us became thicker than grief. Instead, I made myself a cup of tea and told the empty house, well, it's about damn time. But the truth was I was afraid. Not of my son. Never of him. But of the space between us, of what had grown in that space. Like weeds choking a once beautiful garden. His wife Caroline had planted most of those weeds. I won't pretend she and I ever got along. From the moment she slipped that diamond ring on her finger and looked at me with that smile. Too sweet, too polished. I knew she saw me as an obstacle, not a mother-in-law. Still, I went. I dressed carefully, choosing the soft blue sweater my late husband always said brought out the gentleness in my eyes. I brought a pie, though I doubted anyone would touch it. I drove slowly, ignoring the way my hands trembled on the steering wheel. Their house looked the same as it always had, neat, tasteful, every blade of grass cut with military precision. Caroline never tolerated disorder. Even her welcome felt rehearsed. "Oh, you made it?" she chirped, stepping aside so I could enter. Her perfume hit me first. Sharp, floral, overwhelming. She kissed the air near my cheek and smiled as if her jaw might crack. Michael appeared behind her, and for a moment, all I saw was my little boy again. The one who used to climb into my lap with scraped knees and teary eyes. But adulthood hangs heavy on people, and on him it looked like armor. His shoulders sagged, his smile flickered like a dying bulb. "Hi, Mom," he said softly, pulling me into a brief, tight hug. "I'm glad you're here." 3 simple words. I'm glad you're here. Words he hadn't spoken in years. I felt them settle in my chest like embers. The dining table was set beautifully, of course. Caroline didn't know how to do anything halfway. The turkey sat untouched in the center, golden and buttery. Candles flickered. Fancy folded napkins perched like birds on each plate. But beneath it all, I sensed something off. A stiffness. A tension humming under the surface like a wire stretched too tight. It only grew worse during dinner. Caroline dominated the conversation, speaking too loudly about promotions, investments, and their future plans. Plans I hadn't heard a whisper of before. Michael nodded along, but his eyes were hollow. I reached for my water glass, my joints aching. The room felt warm, almost uncomfortably so. Then Michael cleared his throat. He picked up a small gravy boat and carried it to me with both hands like it was something precious. "Mom," he said, I made this special gravy. I wanted you to try it." His voice trembled. "I made it just for you. Just for me." The way he said it made something cold unfurl in my stomach. Michael hadn't cooked anything special in 20 years. He'd barely cooked at all. Caroline's eyes flicked toward him, just for a moment, but it was enough. Something sharp lived in that glance. A warning, a threat, I couldn't tell. He poured a generous amount onto my plate. Too generous. I stared at it, brown glossy, steam curling upward, and he said softly, "Try it." I lifted my fork. My hand shook, not visibly, but I felt it deep in the bones. And while he waited, holding his breath like a child anticipating approval, Caroline stood to fetch something from the kitchen. Her plate sat right beside mine, untouched. Without thinking, acting only on instinct sharpened by age and motherly intuition, I switched our plates. Quick, quiet, invisible. By the time she returned, no one was the wiser. We joined hands for grace, though my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Everyone began to eat. The conversation resumed. Though I barely heard it, I watched. I waited. I listened to the ticking of the clock on the wall, each second louder than the last. 20 minutes passed. Caroline reached for her water. Her hand trembled. She blinked rapidly, as if the room had gone blurry. A faint sheen of sweat formed across her forehead. "Are you all right?" Michael asked, voice cracking. I don't." She swallowed hard. "I feel strange." Her fork clattered onto the plate. Her breath grew shallow. Her pupils dilated. She pressed a hand to her chest, then to her throat, as though trying to claw her way back to air. And then, she collapsed. The chair tipped backward with a violent thud, her body hitting the floor like a sack of stones. I didn't scream. I didn't rush to her side. I simply sat there, staring down at the empty space where my plate used to be. Across the table, Michael's face turned ghost white. He whispered, "Mum, what did you do?" But he asked the wrong question. The real question hung silently in the air, heavier than grief, heavier than guilt. What had he done? And why? Why had the gravy been just for me? The hallway outside the emergency room smelled like antiseptic and fear. I sat in a hard plastic chair, my coat folded neatly across my lap, hands clasped together as if in prayer. But I wasn't praying. I'd done all my praying in the years when my son slowly drifted from me, pulled by a force I hadn't understood. Now, watching the ER doors swing open and shut, each time revealing a brief flash of frantic doctors and blinking machines, I understood more than I ever wanted to. Caroline had collapsed only minutes after eating the gravy. My gravy. The gravy meant for me. The paramedics worked quickly. Chest compressions, oxygen mask, injections. Michael sobbed the entire ride, clutching her hand like a lifeline. I rode in the front, silent, staring out the window as the lights of the city streaked past. I didn't know what would happen to her. I only knew this: if I hadn't trusted my instincts, if I had eaten what my son urged me to eat, I might have been the one lying on that cold metal gurney. And Michael knew it, too. He hadn't looked at me once. When the ER doors finally stopped swinging, a doctor stepped out, pulling off his gloves. His face carried the tight, professional expression of someone who had delivered bad news many times but never got used to it. "She's stable," he said. "But she ingested something toxic. We're running tests to confirm." Michael sagged forward, hands covering his face. The doctor turned to me next. "Did both of you eat the same meal?" I watched Michael's shoulders tense. His fingers curled into his palms until the knuckles turned white. "No," I said calmly. "We didn't." The doctor nodded slowly, as though that confirmed something he had already suspected. "Detectives will need to speak with you," he added. And then he walked away. The detective arrived faster than I expected, a tall man with a patient face and eyes that missed nothing. He introduced himself, then motioned for us to step aside into a quiet corner of the waiting area. "I need to ask some routine questions," he said. Routine. What an interesting word for attempted murder. "Who prepared the gravy?" he asked. Michael hesitated. A tiny moment. But hesitation, like guilt, makes itself known. "I did," he whispered. "I made it." I didn't look at him. I stared straight ahead. "And who served it?" The detective pressed. Michael swallowed. "Mate. And who ate it?" "I did," I said. His head jerked toward me. "Mom, just you." "No," I said softly. "His wife ate my portion." Michael's breathing hitched. He closed his eyes. The detective studied us both. "That's interesting." He paused, then added, "And you're sure you didn't eat any?" I shook my head. I didn't feel well, so I switched plates. Michael let out a strangled sound, half gasp, half sob. The detective stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Ma'am, why did you switch plates?" I met his gaze, unflinching. "Because mothers know when something is wrong." Hours passed. Nurses came and went. Tests were run. Voices murmured behind closed curtains. But the true unraveling didn't begin until the detective sat down with Michael again. This time alone, though I could see them through the window of the family room. It started with questions. It ended with confessions. He talked for more than an hour. His shoulders sagged. His hands shook. his face twisted with shame and fear. And I listened to every word as if my life depended on it. Because, apparently, it nearly had. Later, when the detective came to me, he didn't bother hiding the truth. "Your son didn't intend to poison you," he said quietly. "But he knew about the insurance policies." I closed my eyes. 2 policies, one on him, one on me. All taken out by Caroline. All forged. All signed with a shaky imitation of my handwriting. "She didn't need you dead right away," the detective continued. "Just eventually. But something changed. She accelerated her plan. And my son?" I whispered. The detective's sigh was heavy. "She manipulated him. Years of emotional control. Financial control. Isolation. She convinced him you were dangerous, unstable. That you wanted to interfere with their life. That she needed protection from you." I let out a bitter laugh. It cracked in the middle like thin ice. "She separated us," I said. "She always did. More than you realized," he replied gently. "We believe she fabricated messages, blocked your calls, created conflicts, all to push him away from you and pull him deeper under her control. The truth wasn't a single blow. It came piece by piece, like shards of glass embedding themselves under my skin. Every detail made her look more monstrous, but it also revealed something worse. My son had been drowning, and I hadn't noticed. I'd mistaken distance for indifference, silence for cruelty, when in reality, he'd been suffocating under someone else's thumb. But even that didn't absolve him. He'd asked me to eat the gravy. He'd watched me raise the fork. He'd let the silence swallow years of my life. And now Caroline lay hooked to IVs, and he was left standing in the ruins of the lies they'd built together. The detective placed a hand on the back of the chair beside me. "Mrs. Carter," he said gently, "your family has been living under something toxic for a long time. Tonight just exposed it." I stared at my wrinkled hands, the same hands that had held my son's when he learned to walk. I whispered, "I know." But I wasn't ready for what came next. "Mom," the detective added slowly, "there's more." Of course there was. There always is when rot spreads through a family tree. He leaned in, voice low, steady, cold. "We found evidence that this wasn't the first attempt." My breath turned to ash. And in that moment, in the bright, sterile lights of the hospital waiting room, surrounded by machines and muffled sobs, and the beeping of monitors, I realized something profoundly simple. The woman who almost killed me hadn't been acting alone. She had help. And that help came from the child I loved more than life. The morning after the hospital ordeal, I woke in my own bed, stiff as a board and colder than the November air seeping through my window. I didn't remember driving home. I didn't remember hanging up my coat. I only remembered the sound of Michael's voice when he realized what had happened. "Mom, what did you do?" "No." "What had he done?" I sat up slowly, my bones protesting as always. But today every ache carried a different kind of weight. Betrayal feels heavier when it comes from blood. It sits in the chest like wet cement. I made myself tea, the same ritual I'd performed every morning for decades. Yet it tasted different now. Bitter, metallic, wrong. My house felt too quiet, too empty. As if it knew something had changed in me overnight. I set the tea aside and opened the drawer, where I kept all the important things: my will, mortgage documents, medical files, insurance letters, little notes my husband had left me before he passed. A lifetime of paper and ink. I hadn't looked through it in years. But that morning, I pulled everything out. Because something inside me had shifted. From fear to clarity, from shock to purpose. If Caroline and my own son had spent years weaving a web around me, I intended to tear every strand apart. One by one. The first string unraveled at the bank. The young teller recognized me immediately. "Mrs. Carter! We haven't seen you in a while. Can I help you with something today?" "Yes," I said, leaning on my cane. "I need to go over every withdrawal made from my account over the last 5 years." Her brows lifted, but she nodded and printed the statements. I took a seat by the window. sunlight spreading across the paper like a lie illuminated. There were withdrawals I didn't recognize. Thousands missing. Names I didn't authorize. 2 accounts I didn't even know existed. Each line felt like a knife. I circled them in red ink. Then I called my lawyer. The next string came from my neighbor, Helen, a woman I'd exchanged casseroles and gossip with for more than 20 years. When I knocked on her door, she answered with a look of surprise. "Well, if it isn't my favorite troublemaker," she said, ushering me inside. "What brings you to my doorstep so early?" I didn't bother with small talk. "Helen," I said, "did you ever see Caroline near my mailbox? Or around my property when I wasn't home?" Her smile faded. She looked down at her hands. "Sit," she whispered. When a woman lowers her voice like that, she knows something. She told me she'd seen Caroline more times than she could count. Lurking near my mailbox, rifling through envelopes, slipping letters back in with careful precision, and she'd always acted like she had every right. "And you never told me?" I asked, not angry. "Just tired. I thought you knew," Helen said softly. "I thought she was handling your mail for you, helping out." Helping, that word nearly made me laugh. Caroline didn't help anyone but herself. The next several hours passed in a blur of unraveling threads. I visited the notary office. The man there fidgeted when I asked about a signature he supposedly witnessed. He cracked in 10 minutes. No, he had never seen me sign anything. Yes, he had signed off anyway. Yes, he'd been paid. Forged documents, insurance forms, property transfers. I left him pale and shaking, already dialing the police. By late afternoon, I returned home carrying a folder, so thick it barely fit under my arm. Inside were proofs of things worse than I imagined. Signatures forged on insurance policies worth more than my home. Authorization forms for medical tests I never took. A document petitioning for my placement in a memory care facility. Waiting only for one final doctor's note. Bank withdrawals spaced out carefully over months. Just small enough not to raise alarms. And worst of all, a drafted will supposedly written by me, leaving everything to my son and to Caroline, with the clause that my declining mental condition had influenced the decision. I stared at the papers spread across my kitchen table. The same table where my husband and I once played cards, where my son once did homework, where life had been warm and simple. Now it was a battlefield. My cane leaned against my chair, my tea sat cold, and my heart transformed. Not into stone, but into something sharper. They hadn't just tried to poison me. They had been erasing me. Slowly, methodically. With signatures and paperwork and lies whispered in the dark. And my son, my sweet boy, who used to leave dandelions on my nightstand, because they're happy flowers. He had signed some of these documents himself. Not forged. His real signature. His real hand. There's a particular grief reserved for mothers. The grief of realizing your child didn't just fail you. He participated, even if fear had fueled him. Even if manipulation had bent him. Even if he'd been drowning. He still reached for me in the dark and pulled me under with him. But I wasn't going to drown. Not for him. Not for her. Not for anyone. That evening, as the sun set in streaks of orange and purple across the sky, I sat alone in my living room and looked at the framed photo of my family. The 3 of us smiling on a summer day long gone. I lifted the frame, traced Michael's face with my thumb, and whispered, "You were supposed to protect me, not serve me like a lamb to slaughter." My voice didn't tremble. My hands didn't shake. I felt something new blooming inside me. Something fierce and cold, not revenge. Justice, reckoning. For 75 years I had been gentle, patient, soft-hearted. But soft hearts can still break. And when they do, they leave sharp edges. I gathered the folder, placed it carefully into my bag, and locked my doors. Tomorrow, I would expose every lie, every theft, every betrayal, and when I was finished, there would be nothing left of the web Caroline spun, or the boy who once lived in its center. Revenge at my age isn't fire. It isn't shouting or breaking plates or storming into rooms with shaking fists. No, revenge at 75 is ice. Clear, steady, patient, and merciless. And mine began at sunrise the next morning. I awoke with a stillness in my chest I hadn't felt in years. Not peace exactly, but purpose. The kind of purpose that settles into your bones when you've been wronged too deeply to ever go back to how you were. I dressed in the same blue sweater I wore to Thanksgiving dinner. It seemed fitting, like wearing armor fashioned from the memory of the moment everything changed. Then I picked up the thick folder of evidence and drove to the police station. The detective who had handled the case the night before looked up in surprise as I entered his office. "Mrs. Carter," he said gently, "I wasn't expecting you so soon." I placed the folder on his desk with both hands. "Everything you need is here," I said. Every lie, every theft, every forged signature, every trap they laid. He didn't ask how I gathered it all in one day. He understood when a mother decides to protect herself, she becomes a force of nature. He opened the folder. His eyes widened. "Good God," he whispered. "This is a full criminal case on its own." "Less," I said. "And I'm ready to press charges." When he asked if I was sure, I looked him squarely in the eye. "I'm old, detective. I don't have time for doubt." The arrest by noon, officers were sent to the hospital. I stood in the hallway, leaning on my cane, watching through the glass window as Caroline, alive only because I switched plates, was handcuffed at her bedside. Her face drained of color. Her mouth opened in silent outrage. She locked eyes with me. For years, she'd worn her sweetness like a mask. Now she showed her true face, twisted, hateful, furious at losing control. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply held her gaze and nodded once, slowly, like a judge delivering a final verdict. She shrieked my name as they dragged her out of the room. But her voice no longer had power. Not over me. Not anymore. The confrontation, Michael was in the waiting room when they escorted her past him. He crumpled into a chair, burying his face in his hands. When he looked up and saw me standing there, he looked like a little boy lost in a crowd, broken, frightened, and ashamed. He ran to me. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he cried. I didn't know what she was doing. I didn't know how far she'd gone. "I swear I never wanted to hurt you. Please believe me." I studied him carefully, the way a mother studies her child before deciding whether to scold or comfort. The truth was complicated. He had known some things. Not everything, but enough. Enough to sit at that table and watch me eat something he feared might kill me. Enough to ignore his instincts. Enough to choose her silence over my safety. He wasn't innocent, only lost, and I had spent too many years trying to save a grown man from himself. "Michael," I said quietly, "look at me." He lifted his tear-streaked face. "You need to live with what you allowed," I told him. "That is not my burden anymore." He flinched as though struck. I want to make it right," he whispered. I shook my head. "Some things you can't make right. You can only learn from them and rebuild." His hands dropped to his sides. "Does this mean you don't forgive me?" Forgiveness. Such a heavy word. "I'm not ready to forgive," I said. "But I'm not done living either." And I walked past him, leaving him standing there in the echo of his own choices. The courtroom, the trial took months. I arrived each day with my cane, my documents, and my calm determination. Caroline arrived in handcuffs, her hair no longer glossy, her confidence stripped away like old paint. She glared at me constantly, furious that the old woman she underestimated had become her downfall. The prosecutors laid out everything. The insurance fraud, the forged signatures, the financial theft, the plan to push me into a facility, the poisoning attempt piece by piece, her web unraveled. Michael testified. He cried. He confessed his part. The fear, the manipulation, the guilt. His voice cracked when he admitted he'd let her isolate him from me. Caroline stared at him with pure venom. She had lost everything. Control, money, power. And now even the man she once controlled was slipping through her fingers. The courtroom felt heavy with the weight of all the years She'd spent poisoning more than just food. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, she collapsed into the arms of the officers. I didn't clap. I didn't even exhale. Justice is not a celebration. Justice is a release. Letting go life became quiet after the trial. The silence in my house felt different, not empty, but peaceful. Like a deep breath after years of suffocation. I tended my garden. I read books. I met friends for lunch. I slept without nightmares. One afternoon, Michael showed up on my doorstep. He held no flowers, no gifts, just the hesitant sadness of someone who knows he broke something precious. "Mom," he said, voice trembling, "I'm getting therapy. I'm trying to understand how I let everything happen. I don't want to be the man I was." I nodded. "That's good," I said. "It's time you save yourself, Michael. I already did that for you once. Not again." He swallowed hard. "I want a relationship with you someday. Maybe when you're ready." I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I simply said, "We'll see." Because forgiveness, like healing, takes time. And I had earned the right to take as much time as I needed. Months later, I sat on my porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air smelled like pine and cold wind. My heart was lighter than it had been in decades. People imagine revenge as something loud, explosive, fiery, destructive. But mine was quiet, measured, precise. Not an act of anger, an act of survival. Sweet revenge wasn't watching Caroline fall. Sweet revenge was walking away from the ruins of her schemes with my head high, my life restored, and my future still my own. At 75, I learned something powerful. You are never too old to reclaim your life. Never too old to choose yourself. Never too old to start again. And that is the sweetest revenge of all.